I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the chaos which seems to be gripping so much of the world today, with a series of murder attacks in which a truck was used to take 84 lives in Nice. A sniper murders 5 police officers in Dallas, and another gunman murders 3 police officers in Baton Rouge this past Sunday. Again, on the world scene, an attempted coup by some in the Turkish military is crushed by President Erdogan, who now promises to complete his plan to transform Turkey into a religious Muslim state. And the Middle East Quartet, the United States, Russia, the EU, and the UN, which is working on a peace resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, publishes a report which, on the one hand, for the first time, recognizes that Palestinian incitement to violence, is an obstacle to peace. That's a first for the quartet. On the other hand, the report also blames Israel for continuing its settlement policy, which the quartet also says is an obstacle to peace. Well, in these turbulent times, what better person to speak with than a gentleman who's spent the last 40 years in one way or the other at the center of American diplomatic efforts, especially being intimately involved with events of the Middle East. For 24 years, he was a member of the United States State Department, serving 6 secretaries of state, both political parties, as an advisor on Arab-Israeli negotiations. He served as president of Seeds of Peace, and he's now with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars as vice president for new initiatives. He's a scholar and author of 5 books, the most recent being The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. It's always an honor to welcome back to JBS Aaron David Miller, who's on our JBS phones from Washington, D.C. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us again.
Mark, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, Aaron, let's begin with Turkey. What's this failed coup mean, from your perspective, for the United States?
I mean, it's a contradiction. You have a democratically elected government within certain conventional norms, elected now 3 times under Mr. Erdogan, that is increasingly behaving in an anti-democratic fashion. And I think what the coup and counter-coup shows, number one, it shows that the vast majority of Turks, whether they're Muslim or secular, regardless of what their orientation is, they would have rather seen an imperfect democracy than no democracy at all. But it also shows that Mr. Erdogan has a skillful and willful capacity to maintain control and power. And I suspect, as a consequence of this, and this is clearly conventional wisdom, but it may prove to be true, that Mr. Erdogan, now emboldened and empowered, will be increasingly autocratic and authoritarian, both to redefine Turkey's identity from the secularism of its core founder, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk,
yes,
and to acquire and gain more power. It was quite an extraordinary demonstration of how a leader could play on the system, and literally, he's in social media, call his supporters in the street. But it would not have worked had Erdogan not been supported by at least 40% of the population.
Very interesting. By the way, Aaron, if the military had succeeded in its coup, would they have ended democracy in Turkey?
Well, it's an interesting question. Turkey's had 3 coups in its modern history, and only 22 countries since 1950 have maintained their democratic character continuously. Turkey and India are not on the list, in large part because at various points they suspended democratic process and either imposed martial law or emergency regulation. So the role of the Turkish military in the past, at least, had been to intercede in the interest of what they consider to be the state's national interest, but then to return to the barracks. I don't know how this would have played out, because I think the Turkish military has become a much less cohesive, much more divided and factionalized force. And I suspect that's one of the reasons you saw what you saw, which was a coup that resembled more a Marx Brothers movie than anything that could have succeeded.
There were many people in the United States who seemed to be rooting for the military, arguing that Erdogan was a really bad guy and that it wouldn't be bad to remove him for the Turkish people. As you saw this unfold, were you rooting one way or the other, Aaron?
Well, I don't root. I deal with the realities, in large part because, Mark, you know my view.
Yes.
This region has no comprehensive solutions.
Yes.
No end states to any of its problems. It only has outcomes. And I must admit, I did tweet, if there is a coup, Turkey is going to remain largely undemocratic, and if there isn't a coup, or if it fails, Turkey is largely still to remain undemocratic,
yes.
because you have at its head an individual who I think, having risen in 2003, has become incredibly adept at not only alienating his allies, but in consolidating his power at home. I mean, I actually tweeted at one point, if Erdogan goes, who's going to miss him?
Uh-huh.
And the reality is and someone tweeted back, of course, millions of Turks. And this was before the counter-coup. So the reality is we cannot forget that this man probably commands the support of the lower middle classes, largely traditional and Islamist middle classes, for whom he appears to be a redeemer and a savior. And in periods where the Turkish economy is growing, he actually is viewed as quite a champion. So he, like Mr. Putin, has tremendous staying power.
Fabulous. Incidentally, the United States has military bases in Turkey, which I understand are strategically very important. And that is why some people were hoping, again, I don't know enough to know, Aaron, but some people were hoping the military would succeed, that they were very pro-Israel in their orientation, and they would continue to help the United States in ways that Erdogan might not do so in the future. What would you say to that?
Well, maybe had you been talking about a Turkey in the 70s or 80s, that may have applied, but I don't think it applies now. I think 13 years of Mr. Erdogan's rule has created a very loyal constituency. And I think the role of the Turkish military, after all, there was great speculation that the military, or at least factions in the military, launched this coup in order to preempt what they believed to be a purge. And that purge has now resulted in the arrest of at least 6,000 members of the police and the military, and likely more. I've heard reports that Mr. Erdogan is interested in reinstituting the death penalty in Turkey. So, I understand the compelling character of such a narrative, but I'm not sure it really applies anymore to the Turkey that we're now dealing with.
And what about Turkey and Israel? They seem to have thawed the cool between them, and Netanyahu and Erdogan seem to have been moving towards each other. What does the failed coup mean for Turkish-Israeli relations?
I mean, I think that largely depends on which direction Mr. Erdogan wants to go. If his high-minded authoritarianism, where he becomes the state is me and I am the state, if that continues and he continues to push to intensify Turkish Islamist identity, I think in the end that will bode ill for any long-term reconciliation. Remember, let's be clear. What are we really talking about? We're talking about at best, a patch. How long it's going to last in a relationship between Israel and Turkey that is grounded on some pretty important interests between the two, both gas and military cooperation. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's one that is grounded, in the kind of interests and values, for example, that shape and link the U.S.-Israeli relationship, or frankly, to use a counterexample, but one that is relevant, the relationship that exists between Iran on one hand and the regime of Bashar Assad, which to this day represents a strategic Iranian investment.
Aaron, I remember when the Iron Curtain came down, everyone was surprised. Did this coup take American intelligence by surprise? And again, in the open, I explained to everyone, you've spent a lot of years inside the government, inside the State Department. If it did come as a surprise, should it surprise the American people? But first I ask you, were we taken by surprise by this coup?
I mean, I'm not privy to any more intelligence information, and I'd be hard-pressed to say that the station chief in Ankara and those agency assets who are operating throughout the country didn't have some inclination about discontent in the military and perhaps even a small window of notice. But look, let's be clear. The Arab Spring, Brexit, even the rise of the unconventional candidate Donald Trump has created a number of events. Putin's intervention in Syria, which few people I know predicted. So the reality is there's very little science, Mark, in political science these days. I think we really are dealing with a world, I think, by the way, that is far less dangerous than the one that we inherited 50, 60 years ago.
Oh, why do you say that?
Oh, for many reasons. I mean, I'll give you any number of examples. Ebola killed 13,000 people, and it was a serious epidemic, which could have been a pandemic. Think about this. The Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920 killed 100 million people, Mark. That was 2 to 3% of the Earth's population. Mm-hmm. The Great Recession of 2008 could have been the Great Recession. But the United States, in any number of reasons, learned from the Great Depression and created certain mechanisms which I think softened the blow. We don't witness the kinds of massive genocides, and I'm not trying to trivialize what happens in Congo or even in Syria in terms of humanitarian catastrophes, but you don't have Pol Pots, you don't have Adolf Hitlers, we don't have world wars anymore. So I think in many respects, the world, in my judgment, nor, I might add, do we have the ever-present possibility, which existed for many years and for 12 days in October of 1962. I remember I was 12 at the time, and we were told to hide under our desks in elementary school.
Yeah, that's right.
The possibility, think about it, of an actual nuclear exchange between the former Soviet Union and the United States? No, I think the world, in terms of its danger capacity, it seems out of control. It appears out of control. But even the threat of terror. Well, let me just give you one statistic. Between 2004 and 2014, 303 Americans were killed worldwide in terror attacks. 303, okay? And that's a tragedy. Between those same years, 320,000 Americans were killed in what the FBI would describe as gun violence. Mm-hmm. Think about it. So, no, I think the world, in some respects, is harder to analyze because, in many respects, conventional power has broken down. You have the emergence of transnational movements like the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I think power is exercised in less traditional ways. The world is globalized, which is a good thing as well as a bad. You see the reaction to the trade agreements, NAFTA, the TPP. So I think the world is harder to analyze because the traditional forms of power and alliances have broken down.
Good for you, Aaron. That was brilliant. By the way, you know the American people have been sort of almost whipped up into fearing ISIS and radical Islamic terrorism. And it's made out to be this clash of civilizations that could be the equivalent of World War III. What do you say?
I don't buy it. Because, look, ISIS is not threatening and does not have the capacity to take over most of Western Europe and to ultimately threaten the United Kingdom. I mean, people forget, certainly those who are much younger than I am, but even people my age. In part, this is, I'm not saying that the world's confusion and unpredictability is driven by a 24/7 media which magnifies everything in terms of its intensity. I love CNN. I go on there all the time, but they have this concept called breaking news. Everything is breaking news.
Yes.
In fact, breaking news can break, the same breaking news can break 8 times a day.
Yes.
So I think that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the wake of 9/11, we've all been understandably conditioned to fear, way out of proportion, it seems to me, the real threat here. The Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula is not, I repeat, is not an existential threat to the security and well-being of the United States. It is a dangerous movement. It has the potential to inflict grievous harm on individuals. But it is not an existential threat. That does not mean it is not a threat, but it has to be kept in proportion. Let me just remind you that 9/11, which resulted in the deaths of 3,000 of our fellow citizens, ended up triggering the 2 longest wars in American history. Wars, in my judgment, that were hardly profitable. Wars that we're still fighting, and wars that we, in my judgment, simply cannot win. So we need to be careful that we don't make the remedy worse than the actual disease when we decide what to do about, or how to deal with the Islamic State and the whole problem of jihadi terror.
It is wonderful to get your reaction. But I have to hear how you responded to the Quartet's report. And first of all, they did say for the first time, Aaron, that Palestinian incitement violence was one of the obstacles to peace. What was your reaction, and will that statement have any effect?
I mean, I think the Quartet identified 3 factors, which they've done in previous reports, but not in a way that I think brought a fair measure of symmetry and balance to the overall report. First was Israeli settlement activity. Second was Palestinian incitement and violence. And third was the anomalous problem that no one ever talks about, of course, of how do you have a negotiation when Gaza literally is completely out of the control of the Palestinian Authority and has a large amount of munitions, high trajectory weapons that are increasingly lethal in terms of their precision and their range. So those 3 problems, I think, brought a degree of balance to this report. I think in large measure the takeaway that I had from this report is that the Quartet is basically more or less putting itself out of business, because the circumstances that the Quartet describes would suggest to anyone, even a man from Mars, that this problem is not ready or ripe for resolution right now.
I do want to ask you one question about settlements, though. Do you agree that settlements are one of the obstacles to peace?
Unquestionably. There's absolutely no question about it. Are they the only obstacle? And the answer to that is no. But they are. They prejudge and predetermine the prospects of what is rapidly, probably evaporating as the prospect of a 2-state solution. Where I jump off the ship is when people look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and see one hand clapping. They divide it into a morality play, which pits the forces of goodness, the Palestinians, against the forces of darkness, the Israelis. I reject that. That's a morality play. It denies the degree to which both sides contribute to this nasty conflict that right now seems to have no real prospect of resolution. And we must understand it not as a morality play, but as a competition between, on balance, the mainstreams of both communities. I think communities who still would like, not because they love one another, and I've given up on that notion. If I had my druthers, I would take the word peace, as important as a word as it is, and I would kind of ban it for now from the vocabulary, because it raises expectations, Mark. The Arabs and the Israelis have never had peace in a way that normal human beings would understand it. They don't have it now, and it's highly unlikely, even though I have not abandoned hope. I've abandoned my illusions. They're not going to have it for a long time to come.
Yes, yes.
But, so I think people need to sober up. I think they need to be grounded and understand just how tough it's going to be to resolve this conflict, and to fundamentally understand that this is not one hand clapping.
Very interesting. I only have a few more moments with you.
Yep.
Often, Aaron, we hear critics of the settlements say that Israel is building on Palestinian land. Is it accurate to say Israeli settlements are on Palestinian land?
I mean, I think look, this is a complicated question. I couldn't stand on one foot and answer it. People devote their entire lives to the whole question of land policy and mandatory Palestine. This problem has roots that go back generations. But if you ask me whether or not there are not large amounts of territory in which the Israelis have constructed settlements that have been appropriated illicitly or illegally, the answer is yes. Is there land that the Israelis have built on that is owned and has been owned by the JNF or any number of other organizations? Yes. The problem in the end becomes less ownership and more the following. Because you have a right to do something doesn't necessarily mean it's wise or smart. And the real question in the end is, I call this, the problem of the much-too-promised land. That's the real issue. Can, in fact, a settlement, a solution, an endgame be found that satisfies the national and territorial aspirations of both sides to allow them not to live in some sort of, fantasy peace and harmony? You take a look at the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and you begin to see how functional and how enduring it's been and how valuable. But no one is confusing this with the kind of relationship that the United States has with Canada, or even the relationship that the French have with the Germans. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are interlocking cultural, political, economic exchanges. This is not going to be the fate of this region. I would settle for peace as the absence of war, mm-hmm. If you could secure it, and then over time, slowly, maybe, as attitudes begin to change, and a generation can see that it is actually delivered benefits to both sides, maybe then you could begin to piece together some measure of positive interaction. I ran Seeds of Peace for 3 years. I know I have two children, they're grown adults of my own. Now, I realize, however, that it is possible to take Israelis and Palestinians from a variety of different backgrounds and not put them in a situation where they abandon their national identity as Jews and Palestinians, as Israeli Jews, Palestinian Christians, and Muslims. But you can get them in a situation in which they begin to recognize the reality, the trauma, the pain of the other. And if that is the basis on which this can be built, that recognition and a measure of empathy for the other side, maybe you'll have the kind of foundation that will one day bring us, in my judgment, the peace and security that most Israelis and Palestinians that I know really do deserve.
By the way, I want you to know, you give me chills. I think you say it so well. And my last question is, and you know what I feel about you, and I'm a big fan, and sometimes it's embarrassed you, but it is what it is. Aaron, why don't I hear what you just said, which was so sophisticated and nuanced and subtle? Why don't I hear that coming out of the State Department and the American administration? Why don't they see it just as you've articulated it?
Look, I think I work for half a dozen Secretaries of State. They all had different Secretaries of State. They all had different personalities. I was part of a team of senior officials who actually did feel very strongly and had both moral conviction and were smart, pragmatic men and women. I think there are people, Mark, who do, in fact, believe and hope for these things. It's just government. Look, let's be clear. Government is responsible for transactional arrangements. Governments try to make deals. People, in the end, ultimately are responsible for transformations. And, I have the liberty, now that I'm out of government, to articulate things in a certain way. I have the time to do it. I'm not so sure it's the problem of the Department of State, frankly. And certainly the pro-Israeli sensibilities of, even with tensions at the top between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama, the pro-Israeli sensibilities of the United States government. No American official should ever have to apologize for the amount of support, both material, psychological, and political support that this country has given to the state of Israel. And most Israelis, if they're honest with themselves and not politicizing the issues, would admit that is in fact the case. I think you have a very special relationship. I think there are strains in that relationship, but because Israel is the only country in the region in which values and many of American interests, not all, I'm being honest, many of American interests and Israeli interests coincide, that relationship is indeed very special.
Aaron, you're fabulous. It's always very kind of you to give me time. You know I'll continue to chase you, but I wish you the best, especially as we're watching this political season unfold. And we'll talk whenever possible, but thank you very much.
Terrific, Mark, and thank you. All the best.
Be well. The thoughts of Aaron David Miller, Vice President for New Initiatives at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And again, he says it in a much more nuanced way. It's not that we, some people say, well, they don't believe in kumbaya. It's never been about kumbaya between Israelis and Palestinians. The question is, can Israelis and Palestinians ever live together? Just live together without trying to kill each other. And by the way, it's clear to me, it's not about a cycle of violence. But if people are trying to kill you, as Palestinians often try to kill Israelis, then the finest of Jewish tradition says, the finest, you have a responsibility to protect yourself and your children and your friends and your community and your home. And so you take defensive action. And people can argue whether Israel's been effective, whether some of the policies have been the best policies. It's sort of strange that we, sitting in America, feel we have the wisdom, the experience to tell Israel what their best policy should be. But what you hear Aaron David Miller say is, it's a matter of simply getting to a point where people are living in the same region and nobody's trying to kill anybody else. That's the best you can hope for. And then you hear Aaron say he tragically does not see that happening in the immediate future. It's also interesting to hear him say that one of the problems American society has is there's always breaking news. He used the CNN model, but it's what television tends to do, especially commercial mainstream television, which is based on ratings to get money. Anyway, it's always wonderful to have Aaron on. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to our editor, Dennis Golan, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.